There was a country that was once the richest in South America in the 1950s. While Europe was still picking itself up from the rubble of World War II, and Japan was struggling to find its footing, Venezuela was a titan. Its economy was growing faster than almost any other nation on Earth. People called it the South American dream. It was a land of shimmering glass skyscrapers, modern highways that cut through tropical jungles, and a middle class that lived as grandly as any in Paris or New York. The currency, the bolivar, was so stable it was nicknamed the Iron Bolivar. In those decades, a Venezuelan citizen could fly to Miami for a weekend of shopping and be referred to by the locals as Dame Dos or Give Me Two, because they had the cash to buy everything they saw. But then, within a single generation, that dream didn't just fade, it disintegrated. Today, that same nation has experienced one of the most severe economic collapses in modern history, occurring entirely outside of a war zone. GDP has plummeted by roughly 75% in just over a decade. This is not just a story of a political regime or the arrest of a leader. This is a story of how a nation's lifeblood, its currency, was turned into a weapon of self-destruction. The question we must ask is not just, how did the oil stop flowing? The real question is, where did the rot actually begin? How does a $100 billion economy shrink until it can no longer provide water to its hospitals or bread to its children? To understand the death of a nation, we have to understand the death of its money. Venezuela sits on the largest proven oil reserves on the planet, more than Saudi Arabia, more than Russia, for nearly a century. This was seen as a divine gift, a permanent safety net that meant Venezuela would never have to worry about the future. But in economics, there is a dark phenomenon known as the Dutch disease. When a country finds a massive amount of one resource, a dangerous reflex takes over. Oil became Venezuela's only identity. It accounted for 95% of its export earnings and over half of the government's entire budget. When the black gold flows, the money feels easy. The national currency becomes incredibly strong. On the surface, this looks like prosperity. It makes the US dollar cheap, which makes importing everything from car parts to milk, from clothes to medicine cheaper than producing them at home. But look closer, this is a golden cage. When it is cheaper to buy a tomato from Florida than it is to grow one in the Venezuelan countryside, the local farmer goes out of business. When it is cheaper to import steel from China than to run a local foundry, the factory in Valencia closes its doors, slowly. The nation's productive muscles simply atrophied. Venezuela stopped being a country that built things and became a country that simply extracted things. By the time the crisis hit, Venezuela was importing nearly 70% of its food. The entire nation was standing on a single pillar, and that pillar was the global price of a barrel of crude oil. You see, when you live entirely off a resource, you lose the muscle memory of production. You lose the engineers, the farmers, the innovators. You become a hostage to a price ticker in New York or London, and when that price eventually dropped, the money didn't just disappear. The entire orientation of the country vanished. The collapse wasn't just a market accident. It was a failure of maintenance, a physical and systemic decay. Nicolas Maduro inherited a machine that was already rusting. For years, the state-run oil giant, PDVSA, had been treated as a political piggy bank rather than a business. Instead of reinvesting profits into new drills, pipelines, and safety tech, the money was diverted into political programs and social loyalty. Then came the purge. In the early 2000s, in a massive effort to ensure political control, tens of thousands of experienced oil professionals, engineers, geologists, and technicians were fired. They were replaced by loyalists who had never stepped foot on an oil rig. The result was a slow-motion disaster. Infrastructure began to fail, pipelines leaked into the Caribbean, refineries exploded from neglect. Production, which once stood at over 3 million barrels a day, crashed toward 300,000. This was the literal disintegration of the country's only source of oxygen. When the income stopped, the government faced a terrifying deficit. They had a choice: cut spending, reform the economy, and admit the model had failed, or find another way to pay the bills. They chose the printing press. The central bank began churning out bolívares in massive quantities. With absolutely no backing in real production, they thought they could print their way out of a hole. But you cannot print prosperity. Every new bill printed was a theft. It diluted the value of every bill already in a citizen's pocket. By 2025, the data remained shocking. Inflation in some months hit 172%. In other years, it hit millions of percent. When you print money to cover a lack of production, you are merely burning the house to keep yourself warm for a few more minutes. Hyperinflation is not just a high price tag. It is a psychological breakdown. Money, at its core, is a vessel for trust. It is a social contract that says, my labor today will have value tomorrow. When that trust breaks, the logic of daily life shatters. In Caracas, the numbers on the bills became meaningless. People stopped counting the currency. They started weighing it. Why count the notes when a single kilogram of meat costs more than a backpack full of cash? Imagine your life in this system. You receive your salary on a Friday. By Saturday morning, that salary has lost 10% of its value. By the following week, you can no longer afford the bus fare to get to work. At its worst, the monthly minimum wage in Venezuela dipped below the equivalent of $1, a month of human labor for a single carton of eggs. When your currency loses 30% of its value in a matter of days, you don't save for a home. You don't invest in a business. You live in a frantic, permanent present. You spend every cent the moment you touch it. Because by sunset, the paper in your hand will be worth less than the ink it was printed with. This is how a society loses its soul. When money dies, the future dies with it. When the currency fails, the market dies. When the market dies, hunger begins. This became known as the Maduro diet. This wasn't a choice or a health trend. It was forced starvation. Academic studies revealed a staggering truth. At the peak of the crisis, the average citizen lost 11 kilograms of weight in a single year because they simply could not find enough calories. Empty supermarket shelves became the national landscape. People waited in line for 12 hours under a blistering sun, just for the chance to buy a single bag of flour or a bottle of cooking oil, when the basic items of life, milk, bread, soap, become luxuries. The social fabric doesn't just tear, it dissolves. The government responded with the CLAP system, subsidized food bags delivered to homes, but these were more than aid. They were a tool of surveillance. If you were a critic of the system, your box didn't arrive. If you didn't vote the right way, your family didn't eat. In a country where the market has been destroyed, the hand that feeds you is the hand that owns you. Poverty was no longer an economic condition. It was a political weapon. When a house is on fire, you don't stay to fix the plumbing, you leave. Since 2014, over 7 million people have fled Venezuela. Think about that number. 1/4 of the entire population. It is the largest displacement of people in the history of the Western Hemisphere, occurring without a war or a natural disaster. This is not just a migration, it is a hemorrhage of human capital. The doctors who should be in the clinics, the engineers who should be fixing the power grid, the teachers who should be shaping the next generation. They are all gone. They are walking across the Andes Mountains, carrying their lives in a single backpack. They are crossing the dangerous Darien Gap. They are working as delivery drivers and cleaners in Bogota, Lima, and Madrid. This loss is perhaps the most permanent damage of all. A factory can be rebuilt, an oil well can be cleaned, but a nation that has lost its youth and its intellect is a nation with a hollow heart. Venezuela's real wealth has been scattered to the winds. The human capital needed to rebuild the country is now building the economies of its neighbors. In March 2019, the rust became physical. The Guri Dam, the source of 80% of Venezuela's electricity, failed. A massive portion of the country was plunged into total darkness for nearly a week. This wasn't just a blackout, it was a glimpse into a post-civilization world. Hospitals became morgues as backup generators failed, water pumps died, leaving millions with no way to wash or drink. People gathered in the streets, collecting water from sewage drains and polluted rivers. When an economy rusts, it means the basic systems that keep humans alive simply stop. This is the result of 20 years of ignoring maintenance, of diverting funds, of letting the core infrastructure of the state decay. When a nation cannot provide light, water, or safety, it has ceased to function as a modern entity. Walk through certain districts in Caracas today, and you might be confused. You will see bodegones, luxury stores filled with imported goods. You will see Ferraris parked outside expensive restaurants. The government has quietly allowed the US dollar to take over. The bolivar is a ghost, so the dollar is king. But do not be fooled by this recovery. This is a two-speed economy. For the small, elite, and those receiving money from family abroad, life is manageable. But for the millions, still paid in bolivares, the gap is a canyon. Dollarization is not a fix for production. It is a bandage on a severed limb. It doesn't mean the factories have reopened. It just means the country has given up on its own currency. You can now buy a $5 chocolate bar, but you still cannot find a functioning X-ray machine in a public hospital. An economy doesn't die with a loud explosion. It dies like a machine left out in the rain. It rusts. It happens when the currency no longer represents a promise. It happens when people stop looking at the future and only look at their feet. Venezuela is a warning. It reminds us that wealth is not what you have in the ground, but what you can produce with your mind. When you destroy the value of money, you destroy the fabric of society, because in the end, you can print all the paper you want. But you cannot print a future.